The rich boss sold an abandoned mine to the orphan boy, not knowing it would change his life forever. 13-year-old Billy Ray Miller, orphaned just weeks ago, stood trembling in Mr. Crawford's opulent office, his 5-year-old sister Molly clinging to his jeans as the wealthy mine owner delivered his soul-crushing ultimatum. "Look here, you worthless brat. I'm going to do you a favor you don't deserve. Your father owed me $2,500 in advances he never paid back before he coughed his lungs out in my mine, and your mother was such a coward she died of a broken heart 2 weeks later. So instead of collecting that debt, I'm going to sell you that abandoned mine up on North Ridge for the same $2,500 your daddy kept under the mattress. It's a dead hole that hasn't produced a thing in 30 years, but this way we're square. And I don't owe you the $27,500 in compensation. Sign here and get out. Take your little sister with you to starve to death in that pit. If you don't sign, I'll call CPS tomorrow and your sister will wake up in a state home in Frankfurt while you're shipped off to juvie down in Lexington." The weight of those cruel words hung in the air, a promise of utter desolation. Before we continue with Billy Ray's impossible choice, we want to be transparent with you. This story, like many we share, was developed with the assistance of artificial intelligence to structure the narrative, but it has been carefully infused with human touches to convey a genuine message to our real audience. We are building a global community here and would love to know where our stories are reaching. Please take a moment to comment with your city or country. If tales of resilience and justice resonate with you, consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a like. It truly helps us share more content. Stories like this, though dramatic, mirror the silent struggles of countless children who lose their parents and must fight against all odds to keep their families from being torn apart. Just a month ago, life was different. It was hard, but it was whole. Billy Ray's father, Samuel Miller, was the backbone of their small world. For 25 years he had descended into the dark, dusty shafts of Mr. Crawford's mines, his body a testament to a lifetime of grueling labor. He came home each evening coated in a fine black powder, his cough a little deeper each year, but his eyes would always light up when he saw his children. He taught Billy Ray that a man's dignity wasn't measured by the money in his pocket, but by the honesty of his work and the love he gave his family. Samuel held on to Mr. Crawford's empty promises of a pension, believing that his loyalty would one day be rewarded. He dreamed not for himself, but for a future where his son wouldn't have to breathe the same coal dust that was slowly, inexorably stealing his own life away. Grace Miller, their mother, was the family's gentle heart. She was the one who could turn a handful of flour and some beans into a feast, whose songs could soothe any fear. She watched Samuel waste away, nursing him through the final rattling breaths as the black lung disease claimed him. That experience hollowed her out, leaving behind a grief too vast for her frail body to contain. Mr. Crawford called her a coward for dying, but Billy Ray knew the truth. She died from an exhaustion of the soul, shattered by the loss of her husband and the terrifying uncertainty facing her children. In just 14 days she followed Samuel, leaving behind a silence in their small cabin that was heavier than any stone. Her final whispered words to Billy Ray were a plea to keep Molly safe, a promise the boy now carried as his sacred duty. Before all this, Billy Ray was just a boy. He spent his days exploring the wooded hills of Blackwater Ridge, learning the names of trees and the tracks of animals. He'd watch his father work, admiring the quiet strength in his calloused hands. He remembered Samuel teaching him how to read the clouds for rain and how to listen to the mountain. "This land has a story to tell, son," his father would say. "You just have to be patient enough to hear it." That patience was now being tested in the cruelest way imaginable. The night his mother died, Billy Ray sat by Molly's bedside, watching her sleep. In that profound silence, he felt his childhood recede like a fading echo, replaced by the cold, heavy weight of a responsibility no 13-year-old should ever have to bear. He was no longer a boy. He was a guardian. Molly, at 5 years old, was the living embodiment of the innocence they had lost. She didn't understand the permanence of death. Her questions were like tiny, sharp arrows piercing Billy Ray's already broken heart. "Is Daddy coming home for supper?" she would ask, her big, hopeful eyes fixed on the door. "When is Mommy going to sing our bedtime song?" He would have to swallow the lump in his throat and invent gentle stories about stars and angels, because the truth was a monster too terrifying for her to face. She was his shadow, her small hand constantly clutching his, her trust in him absolute and unwavering. This complete dependence was both his heaviest burden and his greatest source of strength. Protecting her became his only reason for breathing, the one clear purpose in a world that had suddenly become dark and hostile. Their life had been defined by a poverty of means, but a richness of spirit. Their small, weathered cabin was filled with the sounds of a family that loved each other fiercely. Billy Ray remembered the smell of his mother's cornbread baking in the old iron skillet, and the sight of his father, bone-weary from the mines, still finding the strength to lift a giggling Molly into the air. They didn't have much, but they had their nightly ritual of sitting together on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the Kentucky hills, sharing stories and dreams. Those memories were now a painful treasure, a reminder of a life that felt as distant as a star. It was the memory of that unity, that simple, profound togetherness that fueled Billy Ray's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting to preserve the last remnant of that sacred family bond. The shadow of Mr. Crawford had always loomed over their lives, a constant, unspoken threat. The other miners spoke of him in hushed, resentful tones, sharing stories of his broken promises and blatant disregard for their safety. Samuel had often come home complaining about faulty equipment or poor ventilation, concerns that Crawford always dismissed with a wave of his hand. The boss saw his workers not as men with families, but as replaceable cogs in his profit-making machine. Everyone knew the mines were unsafe, that the black dust was a death sentence, but fear kept them silent. Crawford's cruelty to Billy Ray in his office was not an isolated incident. It was the predictable outcome of a long history of exploitation. He hadn't just cheated an orphan. He had knowingly and deliberately created one through his own greed and negligence. The final days of Samuel Miller were a harrowing symphony of rattling breaths and choked coughs, the black dust of the mines claiming its final victory. Mr. Crawford had ignored every plea for better ventilation and safety masks, treating the men's health as an acceptable business expense. When Samuel grew too weak to work, Crawford refused to pay for a doctor, dismissing him as used-up equipment. The funeral was a small, somber affair on a windswept hill, attended by a handful of other miners who looked on with a mixture of pity and terrified self-recognition. Mr. Crawford made a brief theatrical appearance, patting Billy Ray's head with a hand that felt cold and heavy, muttering hollow promises about taking care of the family. The words were a bitter poison, a cruel prelude to the betrayal that was already taking shape in his greedy mind. The miners knew the truth, but fear kept them silent. Grace Miller's spirit, already frayed from nursing her husband, shattered completely after his death. She lasted only 14 days, a ghost in her own home, consumed by a grief so profound it stole her appetite and her will to live. Billy Ray watched helplessly as his mother faded, her light dimming with each passing day until it was extinguished entirely. He was the one who had to find the words to explain it to Molly, to answer her innocent, heartbreaking question, "Is Mommy sleeping with the angels like Daddy now?" He held his little sister close, the warmth of her small body a stark contrast to the cold emptiness that now filled their cabin. In that moment, as he swallowed his own sobs to comfort her, he felt the last remnants of his childhood crumble away. He was no longer a son. He was a guardian, a protector, the only shield she had left against a cruel world. The 2 weeks that followed were a desperate struggle for survival. The small roll of bills Samuel had painstakingly saved, the money meant for Billy Ray's future, was quickly devoured by funeral costs and a few meager supplies. Soon, their meals shrank to watered-down beans and thin corn cakes. The gnawing ache of hunger became a constant companion, and Molly's soft whimpers in the night were a torment to Billy Ray's soul. He knew he couldn't let her starve. He had to face the man who owned the mines, the man who owned their town, the man who owed his father a debt paid in blood and breath. He put on his father's old church shirt, the fabric hanging loosely on his thin frame, took Molly's small hand in his, and walked toward Mr. Crawford's office with a heart pounding with both terror and resolve. The opulence of Mr. Crawford's office was a physical assault. The walls were covered in dark polished wood and the dead, glassy eyes of hunted animals. A thick, expensive rug muffled their footsteps as they approached the massive desk where Mr. Crawford sat, looking at them with utter disdain, as if they were vermin that had sullied his pristine sanctuary. The mine foreman stood near the window, a permanent smirk etched on his face. Billy Ray felt Molly's hand tremble in his. He tried to speak, his voice cracking as he mentioned the 25 years his father had given to the mines and the compensation they were owed. The words felt small and powerless in that vast, intimidating room. Mr. Crawford let him finish, a cruel smile playing on his lips, enjoying the boy's desperate plea before he crushed his hopes completely and utterly. Mr. Crawford didn't even bother to stand. He cut Billy Ray off with a dismissive wave and launched into his prepared speech, each word a calculated blow designed to humiliate and destroy. He disparaged his father's memory, insulted his mother's grief, and then laid out his monstrous proposition, the threat of calling Child Protective Services, of having Molly ripped away and sent to a state home in Frankfurt, while he was shipped to juvenile detention in Lexington, was the masterstroke of his cruelty. It wasn't a choice. It was an execution. Billy Ray looked at his terrified little sister hiding behind his legs, and he knew he was trapped. With a hand that shook uncontrollably, he picked up the pen and signed the paper, trading his family's rightful compensation for a worthless, abandoned mine and the single precious promise that they could stay together. Clutching the deed, Billy Ray lifted Molly into his arms, her face buried in his shoulder, her small body racked with sobs. He turned and walked out of the office without a backward glance, the foreman's sneering laughter following them out the door. "That runt just signed his own death warrant," he heard the man say. "That mine's cursed." Out in the harsh daylight, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The piece of paper in his pocket felt as heavy as a gravestone. But as he walked toward the desolate North Ridge, a new feeling began to smolder in his chest, burning through the grief and fear, a cold, hard resolve. He made a silent vow to the weeping child in his arms and to the memory of the parents they had lost. He would not let them be defeated. He would not let them be separated. This cursed land would be their salvation. The long walk to North Ridge ended at a scene of utter desolation. The mine was little more than a jagged scar in the hillside, its entrance choked with weeds and rotting timbers that looked ready to collapse. A foul, damp smell of decay and stagnant water wafted from the darkness within. The ground around it was a barren expanse of grey rock and sterile dust, where nothing grew. This was the cursed land the foreman had sneered about. Billy Ray's heart, already a fractured thing, seemed to crumble into dust. He had traded everything for this graveyard. He set Molly down, and her small voice, trembling with a child's unfiltered honesty, cut through the whistling wind. "Billy," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the dark opening. "Is this where we're going to live now?" The question hung in the air, a testament to how far they had fallen, and he had no answer to give her. He forced a knot of grief down his throat, knowing his own fear would only amplify hers. "It's just for a little while, Molly," he lied, his voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. He tried to inject a note of adventure into it, a desperate attempt to shield her from the grim reality. "It's like a secret fort. We'll be safe here." But Molly wasn't fooled. Her lower lip began to tremble. "I don't like it," she whimpered, clutching his leg. "It's scary. Why did that mean man shout at you? I want to go home. I want Mommy." Each word was a fresh wound. Billy Ray knelt, pulling her into a tight embrace, burying his face in her hair to hide the tears welling in his own eyes. He had to be her rock, her shelter, even if he was just a boy made of sand, about to be washed away by the tide of their misfortune. Their first days were a brutal education in survival. The only water source was a muddy, sluggish creek a half-mile down the ridge, and Billy Ray had to make the trip twice a day, carrying their single battered bucket while Molly trailed behind him. Food was an even more pressing crisis. They had a small bag with a few potatoes and a single can of beans. The first night he opened the can, carefully dividing the contents onto 2 tin plates. He gave Molly more than 2/3 of it, pushing the small remainder around his own plate. "Aren't you hungry, Billy?" she asked. "I ate earlier," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He watched her eat every last spoonful, the gnawing emptiness in his own stomach a dull ache that he welcomed, for it meant she was, for one more meal, not hungry. Shelter was a term of fiction. They couldn't risk sleeping inside the unstable mine, so they found a small protected alcove near the entrance, shielded from the wind by an overhang of rock. Billy Ray cleared the ground of sharp stones and gathered dry leaves to make a crude mattress. At night, the Appalachian chill seeped into their bones. He would wrap his father's old, threadbare work coat around them both, pulling Molly close until he could feel her steady breathing. He never slept deeply, his senses on high alert for the sound of animals or any other threat that might lurk in the darkness. He would lie awake for hours, watching his sister's peaceful face in the moonlight, a tiny, fragile flame he had to protect from a world determined to extinguish it. He was her guardian, her wall, her warmth. News of the 2 Miller orphans living up at the abandoned mine spread through Blackwater Ridge like a contagion. The whispers were a mix of pity and cruel dismissal. "That boy's got his daddy's stubbornness, but not his sense. They won't last a week," one miner said at the company store. Others saw them as a grim portent of their own precarious lives. One afternoon, a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose kindness was often suffocating, made the trek up the ridge. "Billy Ray, honey," she began, her eyes filled with a sorrow that felt more like judgment. "This is no life for a little girl. The church can find her a good home, a real family. You need to think about what's best for her." Her words, meant to be helpful, felt like a betrayal, echoing Mr. Crawford's threat and twisting the knife of Billy Ray's deepest fear. The well-meaning gossip eventually reached the ears of the authorities. A week later, a rusty county sheriff's car rumbled up the path to the mine. A tired-looking deputy stepped out, his gaze taking in their makeshift camp with a weary sigh. "Son, I'm Deputy Evans. We've had some calls," he said, his voice not unkind but firm. "Folks are worried. The law says you can't be living out here like this. You're just a kid and she needs proper care." Billy Ray's blood ran cold. He stood protectively in front of Molly, his small frame a defiant shield. "I can take care of her," he insisted, his voice shaking. "We're fine." The deputy shook his head slowly. "I'll give you 2 weeks to find a better situation. After that, son, my hands are tied. We'll have to involve Child Protective Services." The threat was no longer a monster in the dark. It was standing right in front of him. That night, after Molly had cried herself to sleep from hunger and fear, Billy Ray felt the full weight of his failure crush him. He stumbled away from their alcove, collapsing behind a large boulder where she couldn't see or hear him. The tears he had held back for weeks finally came, hot and silent, carving paths through the grime on his cheeks. He stared up at the vast, indifferent canopy of stars and spoke to the ghost of his father. "Dad, what do I do?" he whispered to the darkness. "I promised I'd keep her safe, I promised. But she's starving, she's cold. Mrs. Gable was right, the deputy was right. Maybe the best way to protect her is to let her go." The thought was a physical agony, a confession of defeat so profound it felt like dying. He was failing everyone, his parents, his sister, himself. Just as he was about to surrender to the abyss of despair, a small sound brought him back. Molly was whimpering in her sleep. He crawled back to her side and saw she was shivering, her face etched with a bad dream. He gently pulled the coat tighter around her, as if sensing his presence she stirred, her small hand finding his in the dark. She didn't open her eyes, but her voice was a clear, sleepy murmur that pierced his soul. "Don't leave me, Billy," she whispered. "You promised we'd stay together." That simple, trusting plea was a thunderclap in his heart. It obliterated his despair and replaced it with a sudden, blazing rage. Rage at Mr. Crawford. Rage at a world that would tear them apart. He would not give them the satisfaction. He looked at the dark, mocking entrance to the mine. It was a tomb, but it was their tomb. And he would tear a future from its stony heart or die trying. Molly's whispered words had been the flint that struck a spark in the darkness of his soul. The next morning, Billy Ray awoke, not with despair, but with a cold, clear purpose. The 2-week deadline given by Deputy Evans was a ticking clock, and he would not waste a second. He began the Herculean task of clearing the mine's entrance, his small frame straining against rocks and rotted timbers that a grown man would struggle with. He found his father's old tools, a rusty pickaxe and a shovel with a cracked handle, and put them to work. Molly, seeing his determination, became his little helper. She would drag small stones out of the way or bring him sips of the murky creek water, her tiny presence a constant, silent reminder of why he couldn't fail. This wasn't just about survival, it was a race against the system that threatened to tear them apart forever. Their days fell into a rhythm of brutal labor and quiet endurance. Billy Ray would rise before the sun, the Appalachian chill biting at his skin, and work until his muscles screamed in protest. The blisters on his hands broke, bled, and slowly hardened into the calloused hands of a man, not a boy. He learned to ignore the gnawing hunger in his belly, always ensuring Molly had the larger share of whatever meager food they could find, a few wild berries, a fish he managed to catch with a makeshift line. In the evenings, utterly spent, he would sit with her by a small fire telling her stories his mother used to tell, his voice a low murmur against the vast, lonely silence of the ridge. He was careful to hide his exhaustion, to never let her see the fear that gnawed at him when the nightmares came. Their isolation was not absolute. Occasionally one of Mr. Crawford's foremen would drive a truck along the lower road and pause, looking up at the mine. Billy Ray could hear the man's cruel laughter carried on the wind, a sound that made his jaw tighten. News of the orphan playing miner became a source of grim amusement back in town. "Heard that Miller boy is trying to dig his way to China," one man sneered at the company store. "I give him 3 more days before he comes crying to the sheriff." These words, repeated by gossiping neighbors, were meant to break his spirit. Instead, each taunt became fuel for his fire. He refused to give them the satisfaction of his failure. He would swing the pickaxe harder, his silent work a defiant answer to their scorn, proving that his father's dignity was not buried in the grave. As he cleared deeper into the main shaft, venturing into the cold, silent darkness his father had known so well, Billy Ray began to notice something peculiar. In one narrow side tunnel, the rock face wasn't the uniform grey of slate or the familiar black of coal. Instead, it was streaked with a strange, dull, blue-green vein that seemed to absorb the light from his lantern rather than reflect it. He ran his fingers over the surface. It felt oddly smooth and almost waxy to the touch. He chipped a small piece off with his pickaxe. It was heavier than it looked. Believing it to be nothing more than a worthless mineral deposit, perhaps copper carbonate, which was common in the region, he tossed it aside. His mind was on securing the tunnel supports and finding food, not on strange-colored rocks. He had a deadline to beat, not a geology lesson to learn. The day before Deputy Evans was scheduled to return, their last potato was gone. A cold rain had started to fall, turning their meager camp into a muddy pit. That night, as Molly slept fitfully, the weight of it all nearly broke him again. He huddled at the mine entrance, shivering, and spoke into the rainy darkness. "Dad, I'm trying so hard, but I don't know if it's enough." The silence that answered was profound, but in it he heard his father's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside him. "A man's worth isn't in what he has, son. It's in what he does when he has nothing. You keep your head up. You protect your sister. That's all that matters." The memory was a warm ember in the cold. It was enough. He would face the deputy tomorrow, not with empty hands, but with the unwavering pride of a miller. With the dawn came a desperate final surge of energy. Billy Ray knew it was his last chance. He ignored his aching body and the gnawing hunger, driven by a primal need to change their fate before the sheriff's car appeared on the ridge. He found himself drawn back to the side tunnel, to the wall with the strange blue-green streaks. It was a foolish impulse, a gut feeling he couldn't explain. He had to know what was behind it. Gathering every last ounce of his strength, he raised his father's heavy pickaxe over his head. He swung it with a force born of love and desperation, aiming for the heart of the discolored vein. The tool connected with a resounding, metallic clang, a sound entirely different from the dead thud of pick against worthless stone. The impact sent a jarring vibration up his arms, and a deep crack fractured across the rock face. He stared at the fractured rock face, his breath catching in his throat. The crack widened, revealing not more dull slate but something else entirely, a thick, solid seam of the same blue-green mineral pulsed with a faint internal luminosity, under the glow of his lantern. It wasn't just a streak, it was a solid, undeniable presence. He dropped the pickaxe and scrambled forward, his bare hands clawing away the dust and smaller rock fragments. The surface was cool and strangely smooth, almost like polished glass. Molly, drawn by the unusual sound, crept into the tunnel behind him, her small form silhouetted against the entrance. "What is it, Billy?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. He didn't have an answer. He only knew that the heart of the mountain had just answered his desperate prayer, and the cold, dead mind suddenly felt alive with a secret that now belonged only to them. Driven by an instinct he didn't understand, he began to work with a feverish but careful intensity. Using the pointed end of his father's hammer, he chipped away the surrounding rock, exposing more of the mysterious vein. It ran deeper and wider than he could have imagined, a massive frozen river of color locked within the stone. He managed to pry a larger fist-sized chunk loose. The weight of it shocked him. It was incredibly dense, far heavier than any piece of coal or iron ore he had ever held. He held it up to the lantern, turning it over and over. The light seemed to get caught inside it, revealing tiny, crystalline structures that glittered like trapped stars. Molly reached out a tentative finger and touched its smooth surface. "It's pretty," she said with a child's simple awe. "Is it a treasure?" The word hung in the dusty air, a dangerous and beautiful possibility that made Billy Ray's whole body tremble. The immense weight of the rock in his palm felt like the physical manifestation of their future. In that moment, the weeks of gnawing hunger, the sleepless, freezing nights, the crushing weight of responsibility, it all came crashing down on him. The stoic mask he had worn for Molly finally shattered, tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed, not when his father died, not when his mother followed, began to stream down his dirt-streaked face. He sank to his knees, clutching the heavy mineral to his chest, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs of grief, exhaustion, and a wild, terrifying hope. He looked up at the dark, oppressive ceiling of the mine. "Dad, you knew, didn't you?" he choked out. Molly, seeing his tears for the first time, rushed to him, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. He pulled her into a desperate, fierce embrace, the two of them a tiny island of warmth in the cold, dark earth. After the emotional storm subsided, a sharp, cold clarity pierced through the haze of relief. What was this rock really? And more importantly, what was it worth? He thought of the kind old man he'd seen hiking the ridges, the one the townsfolk called Old Man Jenkins, a retired geologist who always had a friendly word. He was the only person he could possibly trust. But a more immediate and chilling thought followed. If this discovery was as valuable as his gut told him it was, Mr. Crawford would move heaven and earth to take it back. He would lie, cheat, and use his power to claim the mine was still his. He looked at Molly, whose wide, innocent eyes were fixed on him. Kneeling down, he took her small hands in his. "Molly," he said, his voice low and serious, "this is our secret, a very important one. We can't tell anybody, not a single soul. Can you promise me?" Molly, sensing the profound gravity in her brother's tone, nodded solemnly. "I promise, Billy. It's our secret treasure." He watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with love for her unwavering trust. He carefully wrapped the largest piece of the mineral in an old rag from his pocket and tucked it deep inside a hidden crevice in the tunnel wall, camouflaging the spot with loose stones. Then he spent the next hour painstakingly covering the exposed vein with dust and debris until it looked like nothing more than a natural, unremarkable rock formation. The mine was no longer their prison or their tomb. It had become their vault, a silent guardian of their fragile new hope. The threat of Deputy Evans still loomed, but for the first time, Billy Ray felt he had something to fight with. This was their chance, and he would protect it with every last ounce of strength he possessed. Deputy Evans's car rumbled up the path, not with a summons, but with a passenger. Mr. Jenkins, the old geologist, sat beside him. He had examined the small rock Billy Ray had brought him, and his eyes had widened in disbelief. It was a rare, high-grade turquoise, unique to that specific formation, worth a fortune. As they arrived, another, much fancier truck screeched to a halt behind them. Mr. Crawford climbed out, his face purple with rage. News traveled fast. "You little thief!" he roared, storming onto the property. That mineral is mine. There was a mistake in the deed." Billy Ray didn't flinch. He stood his ground at the entrance to the mine, Molly holding his hand. The power dynamic had shifted. This was his land now, the very land Crawford had used as an instrument of insult. The boy who had trembled in the boss's office was now the master of this cursed, blessed ground. "You think this piece of paper means anything?" Crawford spat, waving a dismissive hand toward the deed Billy Ray held. "I'll have my lawyers tie you up in court until you and your sister are old and grey. That turquoise belongs to Blackwater Ridge Mining." Deputy Evans stepped forward calmly. "The deed is ironclad, Mr. Crawford. I witnessed it myself. It grants him the land and everything in it." Crawford's rage turned back to Billy Ray. "You worthless brat! I should have thrown you out on the street." Billy Ray's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but steady, cutting through the man's bluster. "You told me to take my sister and starve to death in this pit. You threatened to send her to Frankfurt. Well, we didn't starve, Mr. Crawford, and we're not going anywhere." Defeated, the mine owner could only sputter empty threats as he retreated to his truck, the laughter of his own cruelty echoing in his ears. In the months that followed, Northridge was transformed. Guided by the honest counsel of Mr. Jenkins, Billy Ray entered into a fair partnership with a reputable mining company that extracted the turquoise ethically and responsibly. The first check was not spent on luxury, but on security. He hired a lawyer to solidify their ownership, and then began building a small, sturdy house a safe distance from the mine entrance. It had real windows, a warm stove, and 2 bedrooms. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Molly had her own bed. She started attending the local school, her laughter finally returning, bright and clear. Billy Ray ensured they had enough healthy food, warm clothes, and books to read. He wasn't just building a home, he was rebuilding a childhood that had been stolen from them, piece by precious piece, laying a foundation of stability over the bedrock of their pain. Billy Ray's wealth grew, but his father's lessons on dignity kept him grounded. He knew this fortune was not just his, it was a legacy paid for by his father's life. His first major project was the establishment of the Samuel Miller Respiratory Clinic in the center of town, a modern facility dedicated to treating miners with black lung disease free of charge. No man would ever again have to die gasping for air because a boss deemed him unprofitable. His next act was to purchase a large, warm house and transform it into the Grace Miller home, a sanctuary for orphan children with one unbreakable rule: siblings would never be separated. He became a quiet pillar of the community, offering fair-wage jobs and proving that wealth could be a tool for healing, not just for greed. He honored his parents not with a cold stone monument, but with a living legacy of compassion. While Billy Ray built a future, Mr. Crawford systematically dismantled his own. His public humiliation at the mine, coupled with the story of his callous cruelty, turned the tide of public opinion against him. His best workers, no longer bound by fear, left to take better-paying, safer jobs at the new Miller-funded enterprises. His other mines, already poorly managed, began to fail. Consumed by bitterness and a desperate need to reclaim his former glory, he made a series of reckless financial decisions, borrowing heavily against assets that were no longer valuable. Within a few years, the Crawford empire had crumbled to dust. He was forced to sell his opulent mansion, his hunting trophies, and his fancy trucks, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the bitter taste of his own arrogance. He became a ghost in the town he once ruled, a walking cautionary tale of how cruelty ultimately consumes itself. 10 years later, a stooped, wheezing old man walked into the Samuel Miller Clinic. It was Mr. Crawford, his face a roadmap of failure, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was seeking charity from the very institution built in memory of the man he let die. At the front desk, he came face to face with a confident young man of 23. It was Billy Ray. The moment was thick with the weight of a decade. Crawford, humbled and broken, couldn't even meet his eyes. I need help," he rasped. "I'll do any work you have." Billy Ray looked past him and saw his sister Molly, now a bright-eyed teenager, volunteering with the patients. He felt the old anger rise, but it was quickly replaced by his father's quiet wisdom. "We'll treat you," Billy Ray said calmly, and there's a groundskeeping job. My father taught me a man's dignity is all he truly owns. It's time you started earning yours back." Billy Ray and Molly stood on the hill overlooking their home, the clinic and the children's sanctuary, their parents' grave sites adorned with fresh wildflowers. The sun was setting over the Kentucky hills, the same hills that had witnessed their deepest despair and their greatest triumph. Billy Ray placed a hand on his father's headstone. "We did it, Dad," he said softly. "We're together. We're safe. I kept my promise." He had not become the monster who had hurt him. He had become the man his father always knew he could be. If you believe in the power of justice, in the unbreakable strength of family bonds, and in the hope of second chances, we invite you to become part of our community. Subscribe to our channel, activate the notification bell, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that even the darkest night is followed by a sunrise. Our next story also brings a powerful message of overcoming adversity, and we can't wait to share it with you.